Welcome everyone to the next in our Avemco webinar series. This one happens to be on temporary flight restrictions, assessing and managing the risks. I'm Gene Benson, and with me is Kurt Kleiner in Montana, who is our guest speaker for today. We want to thank Avemco for their sponsorship of this series, these webinars. If you didn't know it, Avemco sponsors, they're a FAST team sponsor, and they pay for the wings that we get when we complete a phase of wings. At the end of this presentation, I'll tell you how you might be able to get a discount on your aircraft insurance for attending this webinar and other safety presentations, so please stay tuned for that. Just a bit of housekeeping. We always start by telling you where the exits are and the bathrooms are. We'll leave that up to you since this is all virtual today. Our emergency would be some sort of a system crash on my end or on the system end. Unlikely, but if it does happen, check your email and we'll reschedule. And also check vectorsforsafety.com because we would post the new date up there, but hopefully that will not happen. So, to welcome our guest today, Kurt Kleiner. He's been a CFI for 15 years. He's logged about 3,700 hours of dual given in 4,200 hours of total time. He's flown airplanes, sailplanes, seaplanes, and paragliders. He just retired from a 29-year career as an aviation manager with the Bureau of Land Management and U.S. Forest Service. And much of his focus was on instructing human factors, risk management, and CRM for firefighting aircrews. And for the last 2 years, he was the National Airspace Program Manager and was focused on refining our Federal Land Management Agency Airspace Coordination Policies and Procedures Manual and teaching agency fire managers and dispatchers how to design, modify, and implement TFRs for the hundreds of summertime wildfires that occur each year in the West. Presently living in Montana, Kurt is very knowledgeable on the subject of TFRs, both from the pilot's viewpoint as well as the point of the designer. So with that bit of introduction, I will switch my controls over to Kurt and give him the reins. Just takes 1 second to make that happen here. In theory, it takes 1 second to make that happen. Here we go. And make presenter. And all right, Kurt, you have the controls, sir.
Okay, I've got the controls, just like in the airplane.
Just like in the airplane, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm going to turn my webcam.
I'm going to go ahead and pull up the slideshow and get her started. And you see the title slide now.
Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to join you on this webinar here, Gene, and really appreciate that. And being June, we're coming into fire season in the West. We already have several fire TFRs down in the Southwest that are active right now, and into late June, July, you'll see more of them pop up in Nevada, Utah, Colorado, and by late July, there should be several up in the Northern Rockies and the Pacific Northwest. So the fire season starts in the Southwest this time of year. They're just about at their peak, and then we'll be kind of migrating north. So it's the way the fuels dry out and the way fire season seems to work. However, TFRs for fires can pop up during the middle of the winter in places like Florida and Texas, and certainly in the fall during the Santa Ana winds in California, we get large fires in Southern California with TFRs. So really a lot of places in the country we'll see TFRs at different times of year for different types of events. So let's go ahead and get started. Does the sound seem okay to you, Gene?
I had to unmute my mic. You're breaking up a little bit at times, but I think it's going to be okay. I think it's about as good as we can get. So
okay. Apologies for those who can't hear it very well if it breaks up, but we'll get started. Okay, so these are our objectives today. We're going to review different types of TFRs and the NOTAMs and some of the federal aviation regs that apply to TFRs, and we're going to look at some case studies that I've worked with in the fire TFR world as an airspace coordinator. Anytime you see this blue box with yellow text and usually a red asterisk. Those are hints, tips, and suggestions for pilots when you're operating in the vicinity of TFRs, just things to take into consideration. My goal is not to tell you how and where and to fly in the vicinity of TFRs, but just give you some things to think about and take into consideration that you might not have already thought of. Of course, our overall goal is just enhancing your awareness and the safety and of your flight operations in the summertime around fire TFRs, or for that matter, any time of year for any types of TFRs. So we'll go ahead and my background, as Gene mentioned, this is a little more detail. I was an aviation manager, but prior to that, I was an aircraft dispatcher in Nevada and in Salt Lake for about a 5-year period, and built a lot of TFRs for a lot of fires, did a lot of coordinating with military controllers at Hill Air Force Base and Nellis, Fallon Naval Air Station, Mountain Home Air Force Base in Idaho, constantly on the phone with all these military guys trying to make sure that our TFRs were, they were aware that we had fires and imminent TFRs about to come up and things like that. So, and then in my last 2 years, as Gene mentioned, I was the National Airspace Program Manager on an acting basis. That position is in the process of being filled right now. So that was in 2017 and 18, and pretty much my entire full-time focus was TFRs and airspace. So as an airspace coordinator for fire management and firefighting organizations, we take assignments to any one of these geographic area coordination centers that are shown on the map. There are some in the Midwest and in the East also, as well as Alaska, that aren't on the map. But those regional coordination centers are designed and in place to move helicopters, air tankers, engines, crews, and all the logistical supports for wildfires all around the country. They are kind of the brokers between other regions and within their own region of moving resources around. So they always have an aircraft coordinator on staff at each of these coordination centers, and they do most of the TFRs. But when it gets really busy and they got their hands full doing all the other stuff, and they got dozens of air tankers and helicopters they're trying to manage, that's when they bring in an airspace coordinator to just take the workload off of them to focus only on the TFRs, and it's a great job. So we serve as a kind of a broker or a liaison between the incident teams managing the fires and the FAA and sometimes air traffic control facilities and the dispatchers at the local level who are working with sending aircraft to fires. So we do interface a little bit with airport managers and, like I mentioned, military airspace managers and controllers and GA pilot groups at airports and things like that. Whenever there's TFRs, we always have an educational outreach going on at the same time. So just as a quick refresher, and again in the upper right corner, there's your reference. That document, that advisory circular available at FAA.gov is the most thorough document that I've found that describes the different types of TFRs. So highly recommend Advisory Circular 91-63 Delta. So there's 8 types of TFRs, and I've got 7 of them listed here, and then on the next slide we'll talk specifically about the disaster TFRs, which are not on this particular list. So the ones that we hear about the most and cause the greatest concern for GA pilots are probably number 3 there. 91-141 VIP TFRs, usually when the president is going somewhere. And we're all taught about intercept procedures. There's lots of resources available about checking NOTAMs and reminders to avoid presidential TFRs, because it could be very detrimental to your pilot certificate if there's enforcement actions. But more and more, you know, we're seeing a lot of these other TFRs, like number 6, we see those at the Super Bowl and the Indy 500, large sporting events that are outdoors. You get TFRs, college football games. And like right now, if you were to go to skyvector.com and take a look, I just did a quick self-briefing this morning on what we have going on. There's a 91-141 presidential or VIP TFR going on tomorrow in the whole Dallas, Texas, or today actually in 3 hours in Dallas, Texas. And then there's several tomorrow around Pittsburgh. So if you're living in those areas or flying to those areas, be heads up and check your modems. The one at the bottom, 99.7, is a special security instructions, SSI TFRs. Those are pretty generic in nature, and you see those for all kinds of reasons. There's the ones over Disneyland and Disney World that are pretty much in place full time now. And then there's some new ones that I saw this morning along the Mexico border in California and down in New Mexico on the Mexican border. There's another one up by Grand Forks, North Dakota today, and that one looks interesting. A lot of times those will, and the presidential TFRs will have an image on SkyVector that says it'll be live in 2 days or live in 3 days, and you get some advanced warning on those. The thing about fire TFRs that's unusual is they can pop up after you've already taken off. We don't know when and where fires are going to start. So those are the ones that'll get you. If they pop up unexpectedly, who knew 3 hours earlier and that there was going to be one there? So they're not forecast or posted in advance. Okay, so the last one that we're going to talk about mainly is the disaster TFRs under 91-137, and there's 3 different types under 137A. There's A1, A2, and A3. And they're very similar, but A1 is for things like gas leaks, chemical spills, refinery explosions, things that are going to create a hazard both to aircraft and people on the ground. So it's really to protect everybody from the hazard. The A3 TFRs are for, as it says there, unsafe congestion of sightseeing aircraft. So let's say there was a large aircraft accident and everybody wants to get up in the air and go look at it, or there's been a tornado in your area. Everyone would love to get a view from above of where the path of the tornado went. So that's when they want to avoid all the unsafe congestion of GA aircraft and other aircraft that are looking at damage that aren't really necessary for disaster relief operations. And the one that we work with the most in the fire world are the A2 TFRs, 91-137, 137A2. Those specifically are for mid-air collision prevention. They're just to provide a safe environment for all the aircraft that we have going in different directions at different altitudes, being worked on wildland fire suppression. So as land management agencies, whether it's a state agency or a federal agency, we acknowledge that the FAA ultimately has jurisdiction over all the airspace, and we just simply want to borrow responsibly small portions temporarily and only for as long as necessary while we're fighting fire. So our goal as an airspace coordinator, my goal is to work with the fire managers and let them know that, hey, as soon as we don't need that much airspace, let's downsize it, or let's change the hours so we're only using it from, say, 9 in the morning until 8 at night. If that's all we're going to fly, we have no reason to tie up that airspace 24 hours a day. And certainly if one area of a large fire has cooled down and there's engines on the scene mopping up any remaining smokes, and we don't need aircraft over there, get rid of that section of the TFR and let's just reduce the size down. So over the course of the life of a large fire, say the fires in Northern California, the ones in the Rocky Mountains, that TFR, that fire may have a TFR for 2 months. It can be that long when we have aircraft actively working at a fire. But there will be many changes and iterations and modifications of that TFR, sometimes a dozen or more over the lifespan of that TFR, because we're always trying to use only what we need and not airspace unnecessarily. So typically, there are usually 5 to 7 nautical mile radius circles. Now, if we have a fire that's really small, maybe 50 acres, and we've got 2 or 3 helicopters on it, and that's it, we're not going to make it a 7 nautical mile radius circle. It'll probably only be 3, maybe 5 at the most in terms of a circle. If a circle doesn't make sense, then we have the ability to draw a polygon or some kind of geometric shape. Now, if you can see my little cursor here, here's the city of Reno, Nevada, and here's the VOR, Reno VOR. This would be an example, like if you had a fire start right here, and you had a west wind, and it was spreading out to maybe to the northeast like this. You wouldn't really need to have a circular TFR that covers the airport and really impacts the Class C airspace. That would be not being good stewards of the airspace. So we would negotiate with approach control and with the FAA to design a TFR that only encompasses the area where we are going to need aircraft operations over here, not necessarily always a circle. So we build polygons, and I have lots of examples coming up of areas to exclude airspace that we don't want to impact. Okay, so there are facts and there are myths about fire TFRs. I've heard pilots say, "What are you guys doing? You just shut down my airport with the TFR." No, TFRs don't close airports. Airport managers close airports. Now, sometimes they close them because they shut down the runway and they lease it out to the Forest Service for several weeks, and the Forest Service uses it as a helibase, and they land helicopters side by side up and down the length of the runway. Yeah, airport managers can close the airport, but there is an exception in the federal aviation regulations that allows pilots to land at an airport, if necessary, that's inside of a TFR with some stipulations. We're going to talk about that. So that's in 91-137 Charlie. Now, remember, this allowance applies to 91-137 A2 and A3 TFRs only. It does not apply to presidential TFRs. It doesn't apply to space launch TFRs. And there's a lot of types of TFRs where this blanket exception does not apply. So be careful there. So in 91-137 Charlie, it specifically says, obviously, hey, if you're assigned to the fire as a firefighting aircraft, like an air tanker or helicopter, you're allowed in the TFR. Okay, that's a no-brainer. But law enforcement, the local sheriff, if they jump in a helicopter, they are legally allowed to enter that TFR if they want to. Now, normally they're smart about it, and they'll communicate with the other aircraft and coordinate so they don't risk a midair, but legally they are allowed in if they need to be in the TFR for whatever reason. Maybe there have been some arson fires and they're doing some aerial surveillance and investigation. A properly accredited news media, again, with certain stipulations. We being the fire aviation managers and airspace coordinators, we work with news channel helicopters all the time. We provide them with information about who's working in the TFR, when we expect aircraft to be in what areas, if we can predict that, and certainly the frequency and the call sign of the aerial supervisor in charge of managing the air traffic in that fire. That's called an air tactical group supervisor. And we say, hey, if you give this guy a call or this air tactical supervisor a call prior to entry, they'll tell you when and where and if it's safe to enter the TFR, and they'll work with you if you need to get in there and get some footage. Now, a lot of this has changed in recent years because now they have really nice gimbal stabilized cameras mounted on aircraft with the news media, and they can get great footage for the news stories from being, 8 or 10 miles away, way outside the TFR. So more and more in recent years, the news media has told us, yeah, you can get great footage. We don't even need to be in your TFR. Thanks anyway. But again, if they communicate and coordinate, they can enter and work in coordination with the fire aircraft. And then this is an interesting one. I got a case study coming up, so an example of aircraft operating on an IFR flight plan. ATC has the authority, if they can assure that their separation standards can be maintained, they will sometimes vector IFR aircraft through a TFR. Now, a typical example of that might be if you have a fire near the edge of a metropolitan area, and we normally only operate the firefighting aircraft during the daylight hours, and say it's during the night and there aren't any firefighting aircraft visible on their radar, they might vector an IFR arrival or departure through that TFR, but they're going to do some checks and make sure it's safe to do so, and they have their own protocols to do that. And the last exception, these are all the exceptions in 91-137, Charlie. The last exception is you and me, GA pilots. But we have to make sure certain criteria are met. So here's what this section says right out of the FARs. If, as a GA pilot, my operation is conducted directly to or from the airport in that TFR, and it's necessitated by it's impractical, or there's terrain or weather, etc., that it's not practical to go land at a different airport. As long as we're communicating with the fire officer in charge, the air tactical supervisor, and coordinating with them, they'll give you a clearance into the TFR, and they'll say, stay on my frequency and call me when you're on the ground, and you can come in here or you can come in there. Now, let's say the fire is making a run towards that airport and it's only a mile away. That air tactical supervisor may say, no, please stay out of the TFR. We're running air tanker and helicopter operations right there next to the traffic pattern. Stay out of the TFR. You got to comply with that. So because not complying with that could endanger that pilot and all the fire aircraft.
So here's an example of a 4 nautical mile radius TFR near Livingston, Montana, and it's right on top of the airport, as you see. So if I were a GA pilot coming in, having looked at and printed off this NOTAM, there's all kinds of key information. It gives the VOR radial and distance of the center of the TFR, the altitude, and this is the important one that we're going to talk about, the frequency that the firefighting agency is using, and this is a regular Victor frequency on your AM radio, and the name of the fire, and the supervisor in charge is always called the air attack. So in this case, you would call up on 118.025, Dry Creek Air Attack, Cessna, blah, blah, blah. Hey, I'm 8 miles north of your fire. I'd like to enter the TFR to land at Livingston Airport. So all you got to do is talk to them and ask them. And now, if you were coming from the east, you wouldn't blunder across the entire TFR. It would make sense to go around and come in from the shortest possible distance. And certainly they don't want you checking out the fire and sightseeing and maneuvering all over. Now, if you want to go above 7,500 feet above the ceiling, that's your choice too. You're not in the TFR, but below 7,500, you would follow their instructions and comply and communicate. It's pretty simple. So to access and land at that, in order to comply with the federal aviation reg, you'd have to make sure it's justifiable. There's no alternates available. Double check the NOTAMs to make sure the airport's even open. It may have been closed. And sometimes for long duration fires, FAA will put in a temporary tower. So there might be a a tower frequency at that airport that they've never had before for a couple of weeks. And then check for advisories. I would be in contact with center before you called up AirTAC and say, hey, are there a lot of fire aircraft you're seeing over that incident? And fire aircraft typically squawk 1255, and so they'll be able to say, yeah, there's 6 aircraft or there's 2 aircraft and they're all on the west side of the fire or whatever it is. And then to make sure that you don't hamper or endanger relief activities as it's stated in the FAR, that's when you would contact Dry Creek Air Attack and get your clearance to enter. And if they say, yeah, come on in, then you can enter that TFR to land. And again, a reminder, this doesn't apply to other TFRs. This is specific to 91-137. Okay, so basically the ATGS, or the air attack supervisor, the controllers at the air route traffic control centers have told me your air attacks can allow whoever they want into the TFR. We basically just delegate all air traffic control to that person while the TFR is in place, and it's up to them. We don't care who they let in or don't let in. Now, if there are people that blunder into your TFR and they don't talk to the air attack and they're creating a problem, yeah, we want to know about it because we can follow them on radar and see where they land and send somebody to have a little visit and a talk with them. So unannounced arrivals or transitions are considered non-participatory and violations, and it requires follow-up. Our dispatchers' protocols is to call the ARTCC at center, report it, and they are required to follow up with the FSDO for enforcement action. Okay, this is just kind of a map of the other ARTCCs around the country, the ones we normally deal with: Seattle, Salt Lake, Denver. You know, right now Albuquerque Center is managing a whole bunch of them for us. So. Now, speaking of intrusions and violations, historically we've been our own worst enemy, but more recently, drones, people that are just hobbyists or even trying to get some footage for whatever purpose they have, entering the TFRs, and that's become a real problem in the last 3 or 4 years. So our procedures is to suspend all air operations, park the air tankers and helicopters until that drone operator is located, and if we don't locate them, just to confirm when they're clear of the area, and then we can go back to work fighting fire. Now, when you think about it, that creates some issues, because if I were that drone operator and air operations had to be suspended for an hour, and during that hour we lost 15 more homes in a neighborhood, that drone operator has a lot of responsibility for that happen when those air tankers may have been able to save those homes. So it opens up a big can of worms to operate a drone in a TFR. We used to have, before we had better education internally, firefighting aircraft that are going to a different fire and they just cut through somebody else's TFR for a fire they weren't even going to. That has largely been corrected with a lot of our training and internal procedures. Used to be a lot more incidents of military aircraft, especially near MOAs and restricted areas, flying through our TFRs. Most of the time, that doesn't happen anymore. It's pretty rare, but occasionally it may still happen, but not nearly as often as it did in the 80s and 90s due to agreements, meetings, education, and a lot of communication by phone daily between the dispatch centers and the military. And we still get a few people that don't check NOTAMs, or air ambulance helicopters are not really an issue. They're pretty good about coordinating with the air attack. Sometimes there is no air attack. Sometimes we may have an inversion, for example, and real thick smoke, and we're not flying any aircraft over the fire. We don't have anybody overhead, but the TFR is still live. Doesn't open the door and just allow anybody in. They can call the phone number that's published in the NOTAM if they can't reach anybody on the frequency. But there should be somebody, even at a helicopter base on the ground, that's monitoring that, the air-to-air frequency that's published. But if you can't reach someone on the frequency, then you can call the phone number and get an advisory. Okay. And this is the bottom line. You know, education has really been the key to reducing the number of incursions or intrusions into the TFR. So here's a couple other case studies. This one is really an example of how we worked with ATC to design a TFR. We had this fire in the Columbia River Gorge just east of Portland a couple of years ago, and there was an east wind that day. So the fire started kind of in this area, and it started spot fires as embers blew downwind, and it was starting to threaten some of the homes that are built in this area. And originally, the aerial supervisor of the air attack over the fire requested a TFR with a ceiling of 7,000 feet for this whole area, because down here, here's a peak that's 5,000 feet. There's several others that are 4,900, several high peaks. We like to have the TFRs at least 3,000, 2,500 to 3,000 above the highest terrain that's involved in this fire area. So that gives us some room to orbit air tankers and sequence them in for drops. So a TFR of that design with a ceiling of 7,000 feet really created an issue for IFR rivals that were coming into the Portland area. Now, on this particular day, it was in early September, there is normally a west wind that time of year, and they're normally landing on 28 left and 28 right at Portland International. On this particular day, we had a light east wind, which is kind of unusual. Probably less than 10% of the days in the summertime we have an east wind. So they were using runway 10 left and right, which wasn't a problem. They were vectoring them all around, and they were all flying in from the west. But at any point in time, and as it was forecast, the wind was going to shift around to more westerly, and they were going to have to start using runway 28 the very next day. And they said, you know what, a 7,000 foot high TFR is really going to mess us up with arrivals, because they have to come in here and intercept the localizer right about at this point. So they said, is there any chance you could split it and make this one a lower ceiling? Well, sure, none of the terrain is high here. All the high terrain's over here. So we made this one 3,000 feet, and this one was 7,000. So that was an easy solution. Now, over the course of the next few days and weeks, notice on the next slide, see this one, initially the west edge of the TFR was in the Delta airspace for this Troutdale Airport, but as soon as the wind came around from the west, we were no longer actively using aircraft on this part of the fire, so we backed the edge off. So now there's a lot more room for GA traffic, no impact to the Class D, and there were several other iterations and modifications to this TFR. On the 12th, 4 days later, we changed it to daily hours. Now, initially, we had to have 24-hour TFR because we were operating Predator-type recon drone doing mapping and infrared photography at night. So we were operating the drone all night and operating manned aircraft during the day on this fire. But they were done with the drone operations, and they said, yep, we don't need it at night anymore, so we switched it. And then we also moved this north edge down to the river. On the first day, the fire actually spotted across the river and burned about 1,000 acres over here. They put that out right away because there were more towns threatened on that side. And so we no longer needed to run aircraft on that, so we reduced the boundary down even further. So the next one was right here south of Missoula, Montana, near where I live. And this started out as a circular TFR. And as the fire grew and it spot fire started outside of the TFR, and we started running aircraft operations outside. The fire manager said, we need to enlarge the TFR. That's pretty normal. That happens all the time. But we spoke with the approach controllers that are managing the traffic coming into Missoula. Spokane Approach manages that, the arrivals. And they said, well, if you can keep it 2 miles away from this approach corridor, that would really help us out. But, you know, if you have to extend it out in the future, well, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it, and we'll have to live with it and work with it. But for right now, try and minimize your impacts to our approach. Okay, no problem. So we designed it with the edge over here. It worked. It worked well for the fire managers, and it worked well for ATC. Okay, a couple days later, or a week later, fire blew up, burned 9,000 acres to the east. So it blew out and made a run towards where that approach into Missoula was on the sectional, or I mean on the charts. And this was the next iteration. So it came all the way out into this approach arm here. Now, this section of the approach goes from like 6,600 and it steps down to 6,000. And then when you get up about here, then they descend to land at Missoula, which is down below 3,500. So this was in the TFR, and a day after the fire blew up, the smoke was really thick. Spokane Approach cleared an Airbus 320 onto that approach, and it descended into the TFR. Fortunately, we didn't have air tanker operations going on over there because the smoke was too thick and it was unsafe to fight fire with air tankers. But by that point, the wind had died down. There were only a couple of helicopters working on that side, down below 4,000 feet. So think about that. The approach calls for descent from 6,600 down to 6,000 feet in that area. The helicopters were well below and certainly far enough away. ATC saw them on radar. Adequate separation was maintained per ATC protocols, and all their internal regulations for separation were maintained. No conflicts, no issues, either within ATC procedures or no near misses with us. But the fire managers on the ground, and they freaked out and they said, whoa, what? They can't be doing that. And I said, well, yes, they can. And they did in a very cautious and legal manner. They routed that IFR traffic through the TFR. Now, ATC will always make an effort to make a phone call to the dispatch center that's managing aircraft and say, by the way, in about 5 minutes, we're going to send an Airbus through your TFR just to let you, if you have radio contact with your aircraft, let them know. And they made the phone call. All the procedures were followed, and it was just basically a reminder and an education moment for our fire managers, who some of them didn't remember or didn't know that there are exceptions legally in the FARs that would have allowed that IFR operation to happen. So that was an interesting. Here's another view of that step down through those waypoints from Tuffy to Seabed and then down into this area. So okay, this was another case study that was interesting. There was a presidential TFR that was put in place, and it said on SkyVector, it's going to be live in 3 days. President's coming to Reno. It's like, okay, we're in the middle of fire season. We don't have any fires going right now, but boy, first thing I did is get on the phone and I called NorCal Approach. They're the facility that routes traffic into the Reno area. And we talked to the Secret Service and said, we don't have any fires right now, but what if we get fires in this area? Let's talk about how we're going to manage that. And so we had a whole response protocol set up in advance. We shared it with our air tanker bases. And lo and behold, the advanced team of Secret Service landed at Reno Airport the afternoon before, stepped off the plane and watched lightning bolts hitting the ground 2 miles from the airport, and they watched air tankers dropping retardant, and they were like, oh my word, here we go. And it was a good thing we had all that preparation and coordination done in place. So this little arrow is where the Reno air races occur up at Stead. And that's also where our air tanker base is located for all the fires. So we had a fire out here the afternoon before the president arrived, and we had some large fires down here that were going to go for a couple of days. And so this was a live image from our AFF tracking program that we use that shows while the presidential TFR was live, we were running air tankers back and forth through the presidential TFR to this fire TFR that was embedded inside the presidential TFR. So it got really complex, and of course all the air tanker and helicopter pilots were like skeptical and going, are you sure? I want to make sure that I have my pilot's license still at the end of the day, and I can't afford to go to jail, and et cetera, et cetera. It worked beautifully. Everything was coordinated, and the reason it was such a success, at the end of the day, everyone still had their pilot certificates. So just a lot of coordination. We had to notify ATC 10 minutes before launching aircraft out of Stead and give them their call sign, tell them where they were going, and it all worked out. The only time that we couldn't fly through this section and we had to kind of go around was when the president's airplane was taxiing in or landing or taking off from Reno Airport. And the president was only there for a couple hours. So as soon as they were gone, it was back to business as usual. So it worked out great. It was a very interesting couple of days, though, of coordination. Okay, at this point, do we have any questions? We're going to start getting into the practical tips for pilots operating around TFRs. Do we have any questions so far, Gene?
We do have one, and first of all, your audio was perfect, so thank you for getting that on. That worked good, and my friend Harry in Vermont was the one that sent me a backside email and said, I'm a retired audio engineer, and here's what's going on. So thanks, Harry. Okay, the one question we have is, can you explain more about 91.144 TFR operations during high barometric pressure? What about abnormally low barometric pressure?
Yeah, so I'm not a meteorologist, but there are very rare occasions when, and I have to say I don't understand the science behind why there would be a TFR for abnormally high pressure. But it has happened occasionally on rare occasions, and I don't know the scientific reason behind why there's a TFR for those. But
okay,
yeah,
that's the only question that that we have so far. Anybody else wants to ask a question, you can just type it in your question panel there.
It may have to do with the fact that most aircraft altimeters only go up to a certain pressure when you set it in the Coldsman window, and occasionally there are days with pressure that are higher than that, so you wouldn't be able to accurately set your altimeter for the correct altitude. Say if you were flying an IFR approach, how would you know? Your altimeter wouldn't be right. Or if you're landing at night at an airport in mountainous terrain, how would you know when you're at pattern altitude? You know, I think it has to do with limitation on our altimeters.
I agree. I think I've run into something on that before. I think you're on the right track there, Kurt. All right, thank you. Okay. All right, no other questions came in, so if you want to continue, it's all yours.
Okay, so just another thing on the different types of TFRs I wanted to reiterate. The 91-143, the space launch TFRs, used to be in the old days, the only place you ever saw those were in Florida and maybe once in a while out in the desert around Edwards Air Force Base or something. But nowadays, I looked at it today, there's a lot of private entities, researchers, universities that are doing space launches, and private companies. There's one right now in southwest Montana, another one in northern Utah. There's one south of Boise, and another one in eastern Wyoming. So space launch TFRs are becoming much more common. The other one, yeah, we already talked about the VIP TFRs that are coming up. But in the fire world, we have 10 in Arizona, New Mexico, and 1 each today in Utah and California. So during the peak of fire season, I've seen 60 to 70 fire TFRs throughout the West on a given day. And it can get really sticky. Okay, so moving on. So as a dispatcher or airspace coordinator, some of the things that we take into consideration, time of day and expected duration. For example, if a fire starts at, say, 6 p.m., and let's say sunset is at 8 p.m., we're only going to be able to fly aircraft for 2 hours. By the time we actually designed and implemented that TFR, it would be sunset. And so if it's a fire that we think we're going to be able to catch and contain that evening, and we don't take the time to put in a TFR that late in the day, sometimes it's a no-brainer. The fire is being wind-driven, it's off to the races, and in the first hour it's 10,000 acres. It's like, oh boy, here we go. This one is going to be at least a week-long fire because it is out of control and growing huge very quickly. Yeah, we might put a TFR on and say it's going to be live for at least another 2 weeks, but we can always change it and take it down later. Current and expected fire behavior is the driver of that one. Now, if we're just going to drop a load of smoke jumpers and the plane's going to be gone in an hour, or if we're just going to unload some heli-tac firefighters from a helicopter and then maybe just have one aircraft with the bucket on it doing support, we might not order a TFR if it's in a real remote area. If it's right by a city or a populated area, right by an airport with a lot of traffic, even with 1 or 2 aircraft, we'll probably put a TFR in. But if it's in the middle of nowhere and there's no other users of the airspace, or very, very few, if any, then we may not necessarily put a TFR in right away. And depending on what kind of airspace and its impact to ATC, we design them around that. And if there's a MOA or restricted, actually the military has told us, we want you to put a TFR and we appreciate it. That way we can ensure that our pilots are not inadvertently interfering and causing a midair hazard for your aircraft. So please put a TFR in. So we always do that if there's a special use airspace. And then we talked earlier about, do we need it for 24 hours a day versus daily hours? There's advantages and disadvantages to both strategies. And should we make a circle or a polygon? Typically 3,000 above the highest terrain, as we pointed out before. And sometimes there's multiple small fires that are growing. Sometimes they grow together and form one big fire, but sometimes we manage a whole complex of fires that may be 5 or 10 miles apart from each other, and we may have one air operations or one firefighting organization managing multiple fires, and so we'll often put in one large TFR because there's aircraft transitioning back and forth and fighting all the fires simultaneously within that area. There are situations where we don't get a TFR. We're not allowed to have a TFR. In this case, if we know that initial attack of that fire is going to be successful by ground resources and we're not even going to need aircraft, or if we do, it'll only be 1 or 2 for a very short duration, there's no need to tie up the airspace with a restriction. Prescribed fires are interesting, especially in the fall and spring. Those are considered planned events, not emergency disasters. We know when we're going to do a prescribed ignition for fuel reduction, and we're not authorized by the FAA to even order a TFR for those, even though we might have 2 or 3 helicopters or something doing aerial ignition on that fire. Sometimes fires way out in the wilderness, no impact to any airspace, very few aircraft assigned. We're just monitoring them because they're not threatening anything. A lot of times we won't put a TFR on those. Okay, sometimes we have these, this example of some fires in Northern California in the Napa Valley area in the fall of 2017. Initially, they said, well, we're managing them as separate fires, and let's not tie up the airspace so that aircraft, GA aircraft and others can transition through these corridors instead of have to go 50 miles out of their way around to get to an airport. This is somewhat user-friendly for GA, but it can cause problems when you have air tankers or helicopters responding between these fires. Maybe this one is growing, this one's pretty quiet, and so we're going to start loaning more aircraft from this fire to that fire. It also doesn't work to have corridors through there if you have one incident management team managing the complex of multiple fires in there. So a lot of times they'll connect them, and it is a little bit more difficult for GA aircraft to have to go around if they don't have the power to go up and over the top of them. A lot of aircraft can climb over the top, but Cessna 150 probably won't be able to if this is in an area where the top of the TFR is at 10,000 feet or something. In this case, we're down near sea level. I think the top of these TFRs was only 5,000, 6,000, something like that. It wasn't too bad. Okay, here we go. This is what we want to really talk about. If you have fires in the area or a lot of TFRs, ask yourself, do I really need to fly, or is this flight necessary? And if I really need to go for some compelling reason, what am I going to do to maximize my safety? And so obviously you're going to have to do a lot more additional planning. So for example, attention to detail on your alternates. You might have to have more alternates that you would normally need on a basic, simple VFR flight, and be ready and willing to turn back, just like it is in flying in marginal weather. Same principle applies. And there's a lot of other things we may not think of that are related to wildfires and flying in that kind of environment that time of year. So let's talk about some of those. As I mentioned, not all fires receive TFRs. Okay. However, just because you're 5 miles outside of a TFR doesn't mean you're crossing. You might be crossing the flight path and the corridor back and forth between an air tanker base that's 20, 30 miles away, and tankers are reloading retardant and going back and forth all day long. And we don't necessarily include those long corridors inside TFRs, but you might get a whole bunch of fire traffic outside the TFR in the vicinity. So just a good rule of thumb is, stay high if you can, well above the tops of TFRs. A lot of the air tanker bases and heli bases, the aircraft are going to be 3,000 AGL and below, between the base of operations and the fire. This one is the one that'll get you. So if I were flying it during fire season, especially if there were a lot of smokes, I don't necessarily know from 1 hour to the next if a new TFR is going to pop up. So it's a good idea to flight follow, VFR flight following with center if you can. Obviously, the easiest solution, if you're IFR rated and you just need to go point to point, file an IFR flight plan. Then you're in contact with ATC all the time anyway. But if you're VFR, see if you can get flight following and ask periodically, are there any new TFRs that are popping up along my route? Even though you did your due diligence and did great pre-flight planning and checked all your NOTAMs before you took off, doesn't mean that something's not going to change when you're in the air. And the bottom there is a little bit of a lag. So as an airspace coordinator, I've called center and said, okay, I'm sending in my TFR request. Here's all the data. And it's usually half an hour or so before it actually pops up live on people's ForeFlight and on SkyVector. So as soon as center gets that TFR and they push the button and send it to the NOTAM office, it's considered active and valid. And there's often a time lag before it shows up on people's software. So just be aware of that. We already talked about transitioning aircraft between bases. Anytime you're near fires, eyes outside, be alert. And what makes that difficult? Smoke. So you get, maybe you only get 3, 4, 5 miles visibility in smoke, and you can't see that DC-10 that's barreling down on you at 300 knots with a load of retardant. So yeah, you got to be really heads up. So if I want to climb up and over the top, hey, fires occur during the hot months of summer. Your density altitude at your 5,000 MSL airport might be 8,500 is your density altitude. And if I'm in a 150 horsepower old 172, or if I'm in a Cessna 150 or something, I might not be able to climb up and over the top of this TFR that's at 9,000 feet ceiling. So take that into consideration. And do I have the performance? Check your performance charts. Can I transition around? Okay. Is there a mountain range right next to the TFR? Can I get around the TFR? Do I have enough fuel? So a good strategy is expand your fuel reserves, personal minimums, instead of having, if my personal minimum in the daytime, say, is I always want to have 1 hour of reserve fuel when I land, even though the FARs say 30 minutes, okay, I choose an hour. Maybe when there's a lot of smokes and TFRs and I may have to go way out and around, out of my way around the TFR, if I can't climb over it, I better plan for an hour and a half of reserve fuel on this flight. Check my weather, check my visibility. Are there any airports in the vicinity that are reporting IFR conditions? Got to do a lot more. So mornings, hey, okay, density altitude is lower in the cooler part of the day, but we get inversions and you get conditions like this, and it may only be 2 miles visibility or less during the inversion. Should I wait until afternoon when the inversion lifts? Is the inversion ever going to lift, or is it going to stay inverted all day? These are questions to look into. And can I legally fly VFR? Better double check your visibility and cloud clearance requirements in 91-155 and say, am I even legal to fly VFR? Okay, so here you have some shots from the afternoon. Much better visibility, no inversion, but you get these massive plume-dominated fires, higher density altitudes. You might get convective activity that's leading to thunderstorm buildup. So you got a whole bunch of new problems that you didn't have if you were to fly in the morning with poor visibility. So there's a trade-off sometimes. So trivia pop quiz. See the picture, the lower one on the right. What is the technical name of that cloud type? And I don't know if we're opening up mics to get an answer, so I'll just say, just for your benefit, for trivia education, that's called a pyrocumulus, because that big old towering cumulus cloud is formed by the convective heat rising off that fire. The fire is the cause of that cumulus developing. And in some cases, they can develop their own weather, and you can get lightning coming out of that cloud and virga, and it turns into a thunderstorm simply because of the fire generating all that convection. So it's pretty extreme fire behavior underneath when these kind of clouds form. So you probably don't want to be anywhere near that. Okay, can I remain VFR in that? If you are IFR capable and current, easier to file IFR. And if you fly with ForeFlight or a moving map GPS with XM, you can see when fire TFRs and you're near them, they'll pop up and you can go around them. If you have a G1000, you'll get TFR info on your map. But what if you have an older aircraft with all analog and no GPS, and if you don't fly with ForeFlight, you're going to probably have a hard time knowing exactly where the edges of these TFRs are and be able to avoid them. So it's well worth at least getting ForeFlight and getting updates if you can. So if you have smoke columns, yeah, it's usually cleaner air on the upwind side. So if you got to go around a TFR, go on the upwind side instead of through the downwind smoke. Okay, just because you're outside the edge by a couple of miles doesn't mean you're free of being in close proximity to other air tankers and other fire aircraft. So give the edge of a TFR pretty wide berth when you go around them. Good opportunity to check PIREPs, give PIREPs to others, especially when visibility is bad. Here's one we might not think of, but there are some human factors associated with flying around smoke. Obviously, impaired visibility. You can have optical illusions in smoke. Objects can appear to be farther away than they really are. There's other optical illusions in aeromedical world about flying in smoke. Dehydration, stress, fatigue, it's a taxing environment around fires. Usually pilots are under some stress of worrying about, I don't want to get too close, or I got to be extra vigilant for other aircraft, and it ramps up the stress on pilots. Smoke from fires and inversions has a high carbon monoxide content. There are lots of situations where over a prolonged period of time, firefighters on the ground, their health and their capacity to work is reduced because of carbon monoxide with all the fire smoke. So the same can happen if you got smoke in the atmosphere and you're flying and it's coming into your cabin. Now, it's not going to be the same level of carbon monoxide you might get with an exhaust manifold crack or something like that, but there is still some carbon monoxide in the smoke, and a lot of times pressure to get there. I've got to get past these TFRs and get down to land, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes the smoke is so bad and you're trying to navigate with pilotage and dead reckoning, and the only terrain you can see is what's directly below the aircraft. You look 5 miles ahead and you can't see the town or the river that you're trying to follow or the highway 5 miles ahead. Horizontally looking through the smoke, it's much more difficult. You can't see anything except what's right below you. That's a challenge. So there's lots of decision making, and just overall human performance can be really taxed when flying around fires and smoke. So just be aware of the human factors associated with flying not only around TFRs, but anywhere there's smoke and fires. And good idea, use oxygen. Just because you're not at 12.5 for 30 minutes or not at 14,000 doesn't mean you can't throw on some oats, and it'll certainly help keep your head a little clear. And in the heat of the summer, stay hydrated. If you don't stay hydrated, that can adversely affect your performance and decision making. Certainly, you'll notice you're much sharper when you're hydrated. So we're getting ready to wrap this up. Here's some websites available that if you want to look at our airspace coordination procedures and our manual, those are in these first and third websites. I also highly recommend checking the TFRs at tfr.faa.gov, and FAAsafety.gov also has resources associated with airspace and TFRs. And our FAST Team Program Manager, his name in the Helena Flight Standards District Office is posted here, but that probably wouldn't apply to your area. But as a FAST Team presentation, I always include this. Do we have any other burning questions, Gene?
There are no additional questions came in, but I came up with a question, Kurt. Your presentation was very thorough, which is probably why there aren't too many questions there. But if anybody else has any, go ahead and use your control panel there and expand it out, and you'll see where you can enter questions in there. Now ask mine while we see if anybody else comes up with one. Regarding the collision avoidance hazard outside the TFR, or as you mentioned, the tankers transiting back and forth from their refueling points or their loading points back to the fire, I'm assuming that these aircraft are all civilian registered and therefore they would all have ADSB out at this point?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, most of our firefighting contracts, they're all Part 135 operators on contract with the Forest Service or Department of Interior. That's becoming, it's in transition right now, a contract requirement to have ADSB out. So yeah, you should be able to see them.
Right. If assuming you have ADSB in, I've been working on collision avoidance lately because I have a webinar coming up on the 16th on avoiding the mid-air collision, and the limitations of ADSB are, one of the things that I'm covering on that. So I'm just curious about that. But can you think of any situations where there would be any aircraft related to the firefighting operations there that would not have ADSB out in them? January 1st, all civilian aircraft operating in the National Airspace System have to have it. Can you think of anything that any airplanes, I know there are exemptions, crop dusters and so on can get exemptions. Can you think of any exemptions or any aircraft that would not have ADSB out?
Well, the only one I can think of right now is that some of the aircraft are on 3-year contracts or 5-year contracts. Most of them are 3 years. And let's say the contract, this is the third of the 3 years, and then next year they have to put in a bid on the new contracts. The new contracts are going to have ADSB in and out as a requirement, but the current contract they're operating on for one more year may not require it. So some aircraft might not have it yet. Now, okay. I think all of the large air tankers are required to have it. Not every single small fixed wing or small helicopter may be required just yet, but certainly within the next year or so, they will all have to have it.
Okay, so moral of the story is keep your eyeballs going no matter what kind of equipment you got on the airplane, right?
Yeah, and most of these vendors that have contracts willingly and voluntarily went ahead and put it in anyway, even before it became a contract requirement, simply because they don't know if they're going to be assigned to a fire in, Class C airspace on the edge of a big city or on the edge of or inside of the 30-mile Mode C ring around Seattle or Denver. They get fires in there, and so if most vendors that are smart are being proactive and going, I'm just going to go ahead and spend the money and get my ADSB upgrade right now. I don't care if it's a contract requirement yet or not. I can't be, I don't want to limit myself in terms of where I can be assigned to a fire.
Okay. All right, good. Well, thank you. No additional questions have been submitted since we started there. So I guess we'll thank Kurt at this point for doing that. I'll take the controls back to mine for the moment and go from there. You were very, very thorough in what you did with that, Kurt. I really appreciate that. Really good job. I've been dealing with that subject for years and years and years, and I learned a lot. I've never directly dealt with the firefighting aspect of it, but I learned a lot about the TFRs in general from that, and I'm supposed to have been teaching this stuff. And I also never heard of a pyrocumulus cloud before, and I used to teach college meteorology, so
yeah,
you always learn something from these. So
I think in closing, I think the best thing to do is get on a website like SkyVector, for example, and click on some of the TFRs, and you can open them up and you can read the NOTAM text. And if you've got stuff going on in the area where you're going to be flying, and write those names down and those frequencies, the name of the fire, and go out of your way to call up that air attack. Now, sometimes they're really busy, but if you are in the vicinity or you're going to go over the top of it, they're not going to mind if you call them up and say, hey, by the way, I'm 500 feet above your ceiling. I'm just transitioning over the top. And, they'll talk to you and say, okay, be advised we have, air tankers coming in from the north and they're 10 minutes out. They'll give you some advisories.
Right,
or
good.
if you're going around the edge of it and you're at a lower altitude than the ceiling of that TFR, they'll give you advisories of traffic coming in and out of the TFR from that direction.
All right, very good. Yeah, very, very informative. We appreciate it. All right, in closing, in case you didn't know it, Avemco offers a safety rewards program. Attendees at this event or any of the other events or anybody who takes safety-based education courses can receive a percentage off their annual Avemco premium at the time of the quote or the renewal. And they take your word for it. All you have to do is just let Avemco know and they'll take care of you. All right, just 3 remaining webinars in this Avemco series. Next up is my presentation on avoiding the mid-air collision. That's an all-new program updated to include the influence and effect of ADS-B. And that one is scheduled for Tuesday, June 16th, week from today at, Tuesday, June 16th, at 8 p.m. Eastern. And then our final 2 events involve some need-to-know information regarding aircraft engines. And they're both scheduled to be presented. They were scheduled to be presented at AirVenture, but since that was canceled for this year, we're able to bring them into our series. And they'll be presented by Sean Benson, who has presented aircraft engine programs several times at both AirVenture and Sun & Fun. And registration links for all 3 of those events can be found at vectorsforsafety.com in the Pilot Talk section. And of course, like all of these, they will be recorded for later viewing on my YouTube channel. So please visit our website, vectorsforsafety.com. You'll find links to videos and to online courses. All but one of the courses is free, but there's a link to a special 50% discount on the only course that is not free. Most of the webinars in this series have been recorded and can be found in the videos section on vectorsforsafety.com. And you can also go to that website and click on the link to join my mailing list and get my monthly safety newsletter, which is also called Vectors for Safety. All right. So as we close out, we will thank Kurt again for this, and we thank Avemco again for their sponsorship of this series. And we will say, remember, always fly like your life depends on it. Have a good day.